Hey, what is going on guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the jungle tier list for patch 8.10. So far in 8.10, it seems like the jungle changes are favoring strong early game junglers and junglers that do have a really good level 2 and do have the ability to contest Scuttle Crab early in the game. Now, one thing to note here before we get into the video is that for the rune setup in this patch, almost every single jungler is now running celerity and water walking. I know in previous patches, most junglers were already running that, but because contesting Scuttle and because just being in the river is going to be a lot more important now in this patch, running celerity and water walking is even going to be better because you're just going to get a lot more use out of those runes due to the fact that Scuttle Crab is a pretty highly contested objective now in 8.10. So to start it off in the tier 1 for this patch is going to be Xin Zhao. So Xin Zhao is one of the strongest dueling junglers. He's got a really good level 2, really good level 3 as well. And Xin Zhao does have the ability to gank mid at level 2 after his first buff. And if he does this successfully, if he blows the enemy mid laner's flash or he chunks out the enemy mid laner, then he guarantees that he's going to be able to secure Scuttle Crab for himself because his mid laner is going to have priority after that. His mid laner can roam over with him and help him with the Scuttle Crab. So I think because Xin Zhao does have a lot of different options as to where he can path in the early game, he's a very good jungler in 8.10. Xin Zhao is still a very good pick even if you don't go for like a level 2 gank mid. He's a very strong dueling jungler, so if you go for full clear and you hit your level 3 and you contest the enemy jungler at Scuttle, then a lot of the time you are going to be able to outduel the enemy jungler, and especially once you do pick up your red smite on Xin Zhao, then you become one of the strongest dueling junglers in the game. Xin Zhao also did get indirectly buffed in this patch with the changes to Phase Rush. Phase Rush got changed to where the movement speed in the early game got increased from 15% up to 25%, so a pretty substantial buff to Xin Zhao's early game there, which just even helps him out more. So next up in the tier 1 here is going to be Shaco. So I'm keeping Shaco in tier 1 in this patch, even though he does get slightly nerfed in this patch due to the jungle changes. I still think that for most elos, Shaco is a good pick, but once you do get up to like diamond and above, I think he can be a little bit more exploitable in this patch just because he's not the strongest dueling jungler in the early game. Shaco's ability to duel in the early game in a straight up 1v1 isn't the strongest for any jungler. If he does have the HP advantage on the enemy jungler because he is running Ignite, a lot of the time he is going to win that, but if he goes up against a Xin Zhao and that Xin Zhao's on full HP as well, then it is going to be hard a lot of the time for you to contest that Scuttle. But I don't think it's the end of the world for Shaco just because you can start on your red buff or your blue buff depending on the situation, so you don't really have to run in to the enemy jungler in the early game, and because you're pathing, it can change depending on the game and depending on what you're looking to do. I still think Shaco is a great pick in this patch. Now, even though Shaco is going to take him longer to hit level 3 in the early game, which you would think is a pretty big nerf to him, I really don't think it's going to matter that much just because other junglers are also going to take longer to clear now in the early game, and that means that for a lot of other junglers, they're going to be running lower in the jungle as well. So with Shaco not really running super low in the early game on HP, his ability to invade and just find the enemy jungler clearing their camps low on HP is probably going to be even better in this patch. So I do think Shaco's ability to invade and just catch out these weaker early game junglers will be even better for 8.10. So the third jungler in the tier 1 for this patch is going to be Kha'Zix. So Kha'Zix is also staying in tier 1 for 8.10 here. He did get hurt a little bit by the jungle changes just because his ability to snowball in the early game isn't going to be as strong as previous patches, but Kha'Zix is still Kha'Zix. He's still a very strong champion overall for solo queue. If you can get ahead in the early game and you can get a lead on the enemy jungler, then you can just completely take over a game and solo carry it on Kha'Zix. Unless Riot does end up doing something with Kha'Zix's ultimate evolve, he's just going to be a very hard champion to deal with in solo queue. If you can get a small lead in the early game with Kha'Zix and you can just go into the enemy's jungle and just sit there and wait for them and just keep killing them over and over as they walk in, then it's going to be very hard for the enemy jungler to come back into the game. And if you can play Kha'Zix well, he's still going to be a very good pick in 8.10. So a jungler that actually benefited from the jungle changes in this patch is Graves. So Graves is a jungler who does clear very well in the early game. He's always going to be healthy in the jungle. He's also going to clear pretty fast. So a lot of the time you are going to have both the health advantage and the level advantage on the enemy jungler. So his ability to contest objectives in the early game, like the new Scuttle crab, and just his ability to just farm really well in the new jungle is great in this patch. If you know how to pilot Graves well and you know how to kite well with the champion, then your dueling potential in the early game is actually really strong. He's a ranged jungle pick, so if you know how to kite melee champions and you can use that to your advantage, then you can win a lot of duels in the early game as Graves. Graves is just overall a pretty low risk, high reward jungler right now because you're not really going to get punished in the early game. He's not going to fall low in the jungle, so you can't really get invaded in the early game by most junglers. He's also super good if you do get ahead with him in the early game because once you do finish your first jungle item on Graves, you just clear camps out super fast, and you also are a really good dueling jungler with the red smite, so you can just look to invade the enemy's camps and you clear raptors out super fast. So you can just deny the enemy jungler a lot of XP and a lot of farm in the early game if you are proactive on Graves. And then the final jungler in the tier 1s for this patch is Warwick. So Warwick does stay tier 1 for yet another patch, with skirmishing and with just dueling in the early game being a lot more important now in this patch, and just securing that Scuttle crab. Warwick does stay a great pick because he is still one of the best early game skirmishing junglers. With his damage reduction, his fear, and his sustain, his ability to outduel most junglers in the early game is really good. So a lot of the time you are going to have that priority on the Scuttle crab, and you are going to be able to secure it on Warwick. Now for my tier 1.5 in this patch, I've been including this tier for the past few patches now in my tier list, and this tier usually includes champions that are really good and do have the potential to be tier 1, but because they do need more games and you do need to put more time into these champions in order to really succeed with them, they are in tier 1.5. So for Ivern and Nunu, I think they're very good if you can play them well. If you're able to invade the enemy jungler and deny them XP in this patch, then they're just going to be even further behind than they were in previous patches, and you're just going to do a really good job at making the enemy jungler useless if you know how to play these champions. Udyr is also really good because he does have the ability to skirmish really well in the early game, so if you can get into some 1v1 scenarios with Udyr in the early game, then a lot of the time you are going to be able to win those and you are going to be able to get an advantage in the early game. Now for Camille, she is kind of similar to Xin Zhao in Shaco because she does have that ability to go for level 2 gank mid, and this is a pick that's being played a lot right now in Korean solo queue. You just have the ability to just go for that level 2 gank mid, create pressure for your mid laner, and then you can very easily secure yourself the Scuttle crab, gain an XP advantage on your opponent, and just look to take over the early game with Camille. And then as for Nidalee, being one of the strongest early game junglers, her ability to just set the enemy jungler behind in the early game and grab an XP advantage and just take over a game is great in 8.10. You do have to know how to pilot the champion well though in order to succeed, which is why she is in tier 1.5. So for tier 2 in this patch, I did end up moving Trundle down from tier 1 into tier 2, just mainly because he doesn't have the best clear in the early game. He's all single target, so he doesn't have the ability to clear his jungle out super quickly and be there to contest the Scuttle crab very early on. He's also not the best dueling jungler for the first few levels, so he is going to lose out on a lot of 1v1 skirmishes against a lot of the meta junglers. So overall, I still think he's a pretty good pick for solo queue, but I definitely don't think he's tier 1 anymore in this patch. So one jungle pick that I think is really good in this patch, if you can play his early game well, is Olaf. Olaf ended up getting indirect buffs in this patch because of the buffs to Cheap Shot as well as Ingenious Hunter. So he's going to have his Predator on a shorter cooldown in the early game. He's also going to do a little bit more damage when dueling his opponent. So because contesting that Scuttle crab and just securing the Scuttle crab is pretty important in this patch, and with Olaf being a very strong dueling jungler in the early game, I do think if you can play him well, he is a pretty strong pick. Now for the tier 3 picks in this patch, a lot of these junglers just consist of picks that are just not very good for the meta with the jungle changes. A lot of these picks just aren't the best dueling junglers in the early game. A lot of them don't have the fastest clears in the early game, so their susceptibility to invades is a lot higher than most of the other junglers. If you end up falling behind on a lot of these picks as well, then your ability to come back into the game if you're going up against a strong early game jungler is going to be very hard to do so. Now, one pick that I think really got hurt by the jungle changes in this patch is Kindred. Because Kindred is pretty reliant on securing that Scuttle Crab in the early game to get her mark, and because she isn't the strongest dueling jungler in the early game, if she's going up against someone like a Kha'Zix, a Xin Zhao, an Olaf, an Udyr, then she's not going to be able to secure the Scuttle Crab in the early game. If she doesn't do that, then she's going to fall behind in XP, and if Kindred falls behind in the early game, she's one of the weakest junglers overall. So I just think that she's a very risky pick in this patch, because if you're not able to get your Scuttle Crab and you're just not able to stay up in XP, then you're really going to fall behind against these strong snowbally early game junglers. So that is going to be all for this jungle tier list for patch 8.10. If you guys did enjoy this video, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you've yet to already. So thanks for watching, have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.